Welcome back to our continuing examination of the story of Jesus as told by Matthew. We shift gears in Matthew chapter 24 as we move away from the series of ferocious attacks on the religious leaders by Jesus to a discussion about the nature of the end of time. We will be looking at Matthew chapter 24, and I'm going to begin by reading a large section of text and working through this. Matthew 24, beginning at verse 1, reading from the King James Bible or the Authorized Version. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us when these things be, and what shall be the sign of the coming of the end of the world? And Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no one shall deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of war. See that ye be not troubled, for these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes and divers places. And all of these are the beginnings of sorrows. Then they shall deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall rise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. If you're going to understand a passage like this, you must be firmly grounded in history. The reality is there are passages of Scripture that can be completely ripped out of Scripture and in the process ripped out of context. Now, I understand that not everybody is a history student or a history major in university, but a passage like this requires us to put this in the largest framework possible. That is, understand that we live in a world where history has unfolded. Now, kind of as a background, let me begin in this paragraph with an article that I read by a medieval historian named Michael McCormick. And this article originally appeared in the Science magazine. And what he did was to say that the year 536 was the worst in human history. And it seems, according to his research, I guess, that there was a major volcanic eruption. Now, volcanoes have come to be recognized as a great destructors and interrupters of society. And we don't always see this because a volcano can erupt in one part of the world and have an impact and influence on another part of the world, several thousand miles away. And that place over here may not be aware that there was a volcano. Volcanoes, when they are large enough, are climate changers. What happens is a major volcanic eruption will spew material into the atmosphere. What that material does is basically represent as a blanket around the earth, which pushes or keeps sunlight and warmth and heat coming in. And so a major volcano over here can lead eventually to a change in seasonal weather. And in particular, think of summers. Summers are vulnerable because in various parts of the world, they have learned to grow crops within the season that they have for a summer. And if you end up with cooler summers, you end up with shorter summers, stuff doesn't necessarily ripen in time, or you end up with unseasonable weather, which can lead to, say, frost when it shouldn't have frost or snow. And the result, of course, is a loss of food stuff. And so when you look at the Roman Empire at this time under Justinian the Great, there was a major famine. The failure of food production leads to famine and the result of famine, of course, is susceptibility to disease. We also know that in this period, somewhere within this, the bubonic plague surfaces. So if you have a population suffering the ill effects of famine, they are more vulnerable to disease. Now, at this time, Justinian the Great, whose death is in 565 BC, tried to reunite the eastern and western half of the Roman Empire. The fall of the western half of the Roman Empire is traditionally given as 476, so more than a full generation. So we ended up with famine. We will end up with disease. We will end up with war. And eventually, just outside this period, of course, is the rise of Islam from the Arab world. In other words, go back to this period of time, and you know what? It wasn't pretty to live in. It was a time of cataclysmic change happening, suffering, pain, and death. Let's fast forward to one of my favorite periods of European history, and that is the 1300s in medieval Europe. Why is this fascinating? Because Europe was on the rebound. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the West is given at 476. The collapse of the Roman Empire in the West leads to the collapse of town, village, city life, and eventual collapse of commerce. It sets in what has been called, and miscalled at that, the Dark Ages in Europe. The 1300s see the emergence of a new Europe with a new vitality, new town life, new economic development. There's all the sorts of this vitality, and boom, the Black Death sets in the middle of the 14th century. And between a quarter and a third of the European population is gone like that. The trajectory of growth development takes a step backwards in Europe because of what happened with the Black Death. Let's take another more recent event. And the start of the Second World War is given from a European perspective in 1939. This is when the Nazis invaded Poland. In fact, if you look at the start of World War II, we could go back to the earlier 1930s and 1931 and precisely, and that is when Japan invades Manchuria and sets off the war in the East. And China would suffer for more than a decade the ravages of war. In fact, if you look back at the Second World War, China loses somewhere in the neighborhood of 14 million people. Russia loses 20 million. We understand there are something like 6 million Jews. Now, and all of these numbers, of course, it depends on sources used. I don't think there's ever going to be a completely exact account, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 million people were killed as a result of the events of World War II. And this, of course, leads to the Cold War. Okay, I've given you 3 eras in human history that were bleak, bleaker, and bleakest, so to speak. They were absolutely bitter. And when we read a passage like what Jesus is giving to us in Matthew chapter 24, we need to put this in perspective, because we understand that life in this world can be miserable, chaotic, and bitter. Jesus is saying just because everything blows up, it does not mean the end is at hand. I know we would all love to think that, but it is not the case. To this, we can add the fact that there are periods of time in human history since the birth of the Christian church of great persecution. What we as Christians cannot do is get caught up with what is going on around us. The hope of the Christian is not found in this time and place. The hope of the Christian is that one day his kingdom will come and all will be well forevermore. And we can bank on that promise. In spite of what goes on in this world, he is in control, and his kingdom will come in power and might and be established forevermore.